Welcome to today's lecture on the reign of Elizabeth I. Today we will study the question, was Elizabeth's reign a golden age for exploration? This lecture will be split into 4 parts. Firstly, we will examine the context, especially how much had been achieved by England and other European powers before Elizabeth succeeded the throne in 1558. We will then study the achievements of famous figures, the explorers and heroes of this so-called Golden Age. We will then examine how these explorers attempted to discover new sea passages in uncharted waters, and how they were more successful in establishing trade through established land routes. Finally, we will evaluate the extent to which Elizabeth's reign could be considered a golden age for exploration, and how it set the foundations for success in the Jacobean Age. Let's begin by looking at a world map. Highlighted in yellow are all the lands that had already been colonized by Spain before Elizabeth succeeded to the throne. As you can see, they are predominantly in Central and South America, including most of Mexico, the Caribbean islands, and the majority of both the east and west coast of South America. In the Far East, the Spanish had also established colonies in parts of Indonesia, plus the Philippines, which were so called after King Philip II of Spain. Let's now look at the colonies of Portugal. These are shown in orange on the map. They include a large section of the east coast of South America, what is modern-day Brazil, alongside the majority of the west coast of Africa, before sweeping around what is modern-day South Africa to the east coast, even occupying the southern coast of Madagascar. Furthermore, we see how Portugal has also begun to colonize the coastline of West India and areas of the Persian Gulf, alongside the northern tip of Malaysia. This meant that England had limited options when sailing out to discover and colonize new lands. The most natural direction would be northwards, to modern-day United States and Canada. Let's now examine where each nation had sailed. Spain, shown in red, was the most successful seafaring nation by 1558. They had already completed a full circumnavigation of the globe and colonized various nations along the path. Portugal had voyaged around the full continent of Africa, across the Indian Ocean, and toward modern-day Indonesia. In contrast, both England and France had only completed transatlantic voyages to modern-day Canada. Under Henry VII, John and Sebastian Cabot had completed a transatlantic crossing to establish fisheries in Canada, which were established in the imaginatively named Newfoundland. Whig historians writing in the Victorian Age have glorified Elizabeth's reign as a golden age for exploration that resulted in the establishment of the British Empire. The heroes of the Elizabethan Age, especially Francis Drake and Sir Walter Raleigh, were glorified as a result. They were held up as heroes who founded the British Empire and turned into romantic heroes in Victorian literature and theatre. Certainly there was more achieved under Elizabeth than any of her predecessors. However, most revisionist historians believe the Victorian interpretation is an exaggeration of the achievements of these early explorers. The revisionists argue that little was achieved by these explorers, with many voyages ending in catastrophe. The sponsored privateering did bring loot from Spanish galleons, but it escalated tensions with Spain that would result in the Spanish Armada. Explorers would return from their voyages with little more than fool's gold, if they returned at all. And trade routes were established, but not without conflict with native leaders of Spanish and Portuguese merchants. Yet the pursuits continued, and with every failed voyage, a new lesson was learnt. Let's now examine the achievements of key explorers of Elizabeth's reign. The first notable explorer was Sir John Hawkins, who in 1562 and 164 had his campaigns sponsored by Cecil, Leicester, and secretly the Queen herself. He was given the mission to break Spain's monopoly in the New World, especially in the Caribbean. Notoriously, Hawkins was the explorer who established the transatlantic slave trade. He traded cloth produced with English wool for slaves on the west coast of Africa. He then transported the slaves to the Caribbean. In 1568, he faced open conflict with the Spanish at the Mexican port of San Juan Ulua. His fleet of boats docked to top up on supplies before their journey home but faced resistance from the Spanish. The naval battle was a resounding victory for the Spanish, showing that at this early stage, the English were far behind the Spanish in terms of the naval prowess and position in the Caribbean. Francis Drake was the most famous of all the Elizabethan explorers. The Victorians erected a grand bronze statue to Drake in Plymouth, which was the port town where he began many of his voyages. Drake's most notable achievements come as the naval commander of the English fleet in defense of the Spanish Armada. It was Drake who led the raid to Cadiz in 1587 that delayed the Armada by 18 months, and it was Drake who devised the fireship tactic that broke the Armada defenses during the battle. Therefore, Drake should be remembered as a military hero of England. Drake also achieved numerous feats as an explorer. Most notably, his circumnavigation of the globe, which took him 3 years from 1577 and 1580. Drake was not the first to complete a circumnavigation. Spanish explorers had beaten him to it. During this voyage, he explored the west coast of America, which at the time was uninhabited, in an attempt to find a passage to the east coast of China. However, he failed to find a suitable route, since he had limited understanding of the Pacific Ocean. After a storm blew his fleet down the south coast of Argentina, Drake also attempted to form a passage across the southern tip of the continent of South America, essentially entering Antarctica. This was a treacherous passage, and only his flagship, the Golden Hind, was able to enter. Drake did not succeed. He had to turn back and travel all the way back up to the Caribbean to continue his voyage. Nonetheless, the passage is still known today as the Drake Passage. The third notable explorer was Sir Walter Raleigh. Raleigh began his career as a committed Protestant who served in France during the 1560s in support of the Huguenot cause. He then completed a voyage, led by an explorer named Frobisher, between 1575 and 1577 in search of a northwest passage. On his return, Raleigh served in Ireland, establishing the first Protestant colony in County Munster and suppressing a rebellion led by an Irish earl named Desmond. However, despite being awarded a large plantation in Ireland, he decided to continue on his career as an explorer. In 1584, Elizabeth granted Walter Raleigh a royal charter for a voyage to the New World, alongside her permission for him to establish a colony there. Raleigh was essentially given sovereignty over any new land he conquered. In return, the crown would receive 1/5 of the gold or silver mined there. Raleigh wasn't the first explorer to be given this charter. Sir Humphrey Gilbert had been the first, but he had died at sea. Raleigh gained greater success. His first attempt in 1585 failed, but on his second attempt in 1587 he established a colony at Roanoke Island, off modern-day North Carolina. However, Raleigh was never present at Roanoke Island. He sent a large group ahead of him, including families, using an established route. He then delayed his own voyage so he could assist in the naval preparations for the Spanish Armada. As a result, when he did finally arrive, all the colonists had disappeared. Therefore, Roanoke Island has been known throughout history as the Lost Colony. Let's now examine the extent to which Elizabethan explorers were able to establish new sea passages. These passages formed part of the quest to fill in the missing gaps on the map. European explorers were especially interested in finding quicker sea voyages to the Far East, especially China, than the traditional land routes. This would then allow merchants to establish new trade routes and trading posts, increasing the amount of exotic goods that would arrive from the Far East. During Edward's reign, the Muscovy Company was established, which focused on exploration into Russia. As part of this, an explorer named Willoughby had attempted to establish a northeast passage but had been blocked by ice. Then, during a second attempt, he died. However, in the 1560s, the Muscovy Company explored southern Russia and Persia, and they were able to establish strong trading links. This helped to break the monopoly of trade by the German Hanseatic League in the Baltic region. The second expedition was led by an explorer called Frobisher, who sailed northwestwards in search of a passage that travels across the Arctic Circle, traversing the breadth of North Canada. The ultimate goal was to find a passage to the east coast of Canada, but this was far too ambitious. It took Frobisher 5 years to raise the funds for his expedition, eventually gaining the sponsorship of the Muscovy Company. Frobisher attempted this feat 3 times, each time mapping out new areas of Canada's northeastern shoreline. He also returned from his second and third expedition with hundreds of tons of ore, hoping that once refined, it would turn out to be gold. However, it turned out to be fool's gold, in other words, a worthless version of iron. Let's now examine the growth of trading companies under Elizabeth and how they helped to diversify the English economy. During Henry VII's reign, the only notable trading companies were engaged in European trade, most notably the merchants of the Staple and the merchant adventurers, who established trade routes for the wool and cloth trade to northern Europe. A German trading company called the Hanseatic League dominated trade across the Baltic and northeast Europe, and Venetian trading companies dominated southern Europe and the Mediterranean. However, by Elizabeth's reign, English trading companies were looking to establish trade routes beyond Europe. This meant they could bring exotic goods back to England that would fuel the growing consumerist market in London and other larger towns, especially given the growth of the middle class. Trading companies were able to use known land routes to establish trading posts. In this sense, their enterprise involved less risk than the seafaring explorers who charted out new sea passages. However, they were not entering unknown territory, and so inevitably would fall into conflict with other European powers or native rulers. The first trading company was the Muscovy Company, established in 1555, so during Mary's reign. The Muscovy Company were granted a monopoly of trade with Russia, specifically the region of Muscovy, which was the principality surrounding the city of Moscow that also contained Russia's largest river, the Volga. In 1562, the Chancellor of the Muscovy Company, Antony Jenkinson, led an expedition to establish a new land route through Russia to northern China. Though this was unsuccessful, Jenkinson was able to strengthen England's diplomatic relationship with Russia, to the point where the Russian Tsar Ivan IV spoke to Jenkinson about a potential marriage prospect with Elizabeth. However, once these negotiations broke down, relations soured. In 1571, Ivan IV revoked the company's right to free trade and navigation down the Volga River. Jenkinson was able to recover this right, but relations never fully recovered, since the new Russian Tsar favored Philip during the Anglo-Spanish War. This shows that, whilst these trading companies provided a more stable form of income than the explorers in the New World, the trade could easily be disrupted by a shift in international politics. The Levant Company was established in 1592 through a merger of the Venice and the Turkey Company. The goal of the company was to maintain and strengthen trading relations with the Ottoman Empire. The goal was not to establish colonies in Asia Minor, but rather to set up factories and trading posts in the region, which they achieved in Aleppo, Constantinople, and Alexandria. The company faced attacks from Spanish galleons as a result of the ongoing Anglo-Spanish War, but they were heavily armed, and so were able to defeat the Spanish in 4 pitched naval battles between 1586 and 1600. They were so successful as a trading company that James I renewed their charter in 1606 and granted them further privileges. The East India Company is the most famous of the trading companies to be established under Elizabeth's reign, since it would go on to colonize the Bay of Bengal of India in the 18th century, setting the foundations for the British Raj in the Victorian age. However, it wasn't until 1601 that the company conducted their first voyage under the command of Sir John Lancaster, and the voyage did not go to India but rather to Indonesia, which was called the East Indies. Before this point, trade in the Indian subcontinent had been dominated by the Portuguese. However, by the turn of the 17th century, the Portuguese trading posts were poorly defended. During Lancaster's first voyage, he was able to seize 1,200 tons of pepper and spices. Though Elizabeth had died by his return, Lancaster was knighted by James I for his success. Let's now evaluate whether the Elizabethan age could be considered a golden age of exploration. Firstly, it is worth noting how Elizabeth had achieved far more than any other Tudor monarch, and she had taken steps to bridge the gap between England and her rival nations of Spain and Portugal. The trade routes established into Russia and Asia Minor certainly proved a success, and diversified the import of goods with exciting products like spices, silks, and new medicines. However, England was many centuries off achieving a global trading economy, and only the very rich, particularly those living in London, benefited from this new diverse range of exotic goods. Therefore, we can confidently say that Elizabeth gained more success than her predecessors at New World exploration, but England had yet to reach its golden age for exploration. Instead, one could argue that Elizabeth established the foundation for future success. Future explorers would use the maps and cartography skills that these early explorers had established, and they would learn from their mistakes. When her father broke with Rome in 1534, he declared as part of his Act of Supremacy that England was an empire. In this, he meant that England had full sovereignty over her own laws. By Elizabeth's reign, scholars were beginning to link the term empire to the exploration and then colonization of new lands. With this came the view that any native population of that land was barbaric and in need of civilization through conversion to the Christian faith. This very much lays the foundation for the mindset of future generations who would form colonies across the globe in the name of both the British Crown and the Anglican faith. If Elizabeth's reign set the foundations for a future empire, then it was the reign of her successor James I that was truly the golden age. In 1607, only 4 years after Elizabeth's death, 104 English men set sail for North America and established the first successful colony, is Jamestown, so named after their king. The region would then be named Virginia in honor of the late Queen. Then in 1620, the famous Mayflower ship carried 102 so-called pilgrims across the Atlantic to establish the town of Plymouth in Massachusetts. This would found what we now know as New England, and become a land where Puritans could escape the constraints of the Anglican faith and practice their faith freely. 150 years later, the colonists would fight the War of Independence, and the United States of America would be born. Let's now return to our overarching question of, was Elizabeth's reign a golden age of exploration? Firstly, it is worth remembering that England sat in bronze position behind Spain and Portugal in the race to discover and colonize new lands, and this made it difficult, since they would often run into conflict with these rivals. However, there were some notable achievements by famous explorers. Hawkins established the transatlantic slave trade, an infamous feat but one we cannot ignore as part of the history of the British Empire. Drake circumnavigated the globe and successfully harassed the Spanish at sea, but he did not establish any new colonies in the New World. Sir Walter Raleigh was the first to establish a colony in modern-day North Carolina called Roanoke Island, but all the inhabitants died within a few short years. Therefore, it is fair to say that the Victorians have exaggerated the claim that Elizabeth's reign was a golden age for exploration. Instead, the greatest success came in establishing new sea passages in North Canada and new land trading routes in Russia and Asia Minor. By the end of the reign, the East India Company were established, and it would be this company that would see the greatest success in later centuries, once they had set up trading posts in Bengal. But during Elizabeth's reign, they only completed one voyage, and this was to Indonesia, not the Indian subcontinent. Therefore, it is fair to say that Elizabeth's reign lay a foundation for future success. It is no coincidence that England was able to successfully colonize the northeast coast of America in the 20 years that followed her death. However, the success was limited in terms of short-term gains to boost the Elizabethan economy. Thank you for listening. Tune into my next lecture to assess whether Elizabeth's reign saw a golden age in culture and the arts.